This is the video that is about to go out to the entire world. Watch this right now.
We keep stimulating, if we keep printing, if we keep bailing out, within a couple of years, we're going to have a currency crisis. And what that means is the dollar is going to collapse, and the cost of living is just going to run out of control.
The Dow Jones is now up 70% from its low in March of 2009. Oil is up 86% from its low in February of 2009. Copper is up 172% from its low in December of 2008. Prices for almost all stocks and commodities have been going through the roof, having analysts on Wall Street proclaiming the recession is over and an economic recovery is here. But how could an economic recovery be here if U6 unemployment is still at a multi-decade high of 16.9%? The truth is, our economy is not recovering. Prices are only rising due to inflation. Our economy is currently experiencing a melt-up. In 2009, Americans received $2.1 trillion from the government in the form of transfer payments, which equaled the $2.1 trillion they paid in taxes. In 2010, the government will pay out more in benefits than it will receive in taxes, and the U.S. budget deficit is projected to reach $1.6 trillion. Government spending has gotten so far out of control that if Americans were taxed 100% of their income, it wouldn't be enough to balance the budget.
Nobody admits that this country's bankrupt, but they're still spending. The worse the problems get, the more they spend, and the bigger the debt gets. And this can't last, and I think the handwriting's on the wall.
When Medicare was created in 1966, it cost $3 billion per year, and the House Ways and Means Committee estimated that the cost would rise to $12 billion per year in 1990. The actual cost of Medicare in 1990 was $107 billion, 792% more than projected, and today it costs $408 billion annually. In 2003, at the beginning of the Iraq War, the White House estimated that the war would have a total cost of $50 to $60 billion. In reality, it has already cost $713 billion, over 1,000% more than projected. The Congressional Budget Office is estimating that the recently passed healthcare bill will cost $940 billion over the next 10 years. If history is any indication, the actual cost of the healthcare bill over the next decade will be many $trillion, making it the final nail in the coffin of the U.S. economy. Oil reached a high in July of 2008 of $147 per barrel, despite diminishing demand from developed nations. Congress held hearings on why oil prices were rising, not realizing it was their deficit spending that was driving oil prices through the roof. When oil reached $147 per barrel, U6 unemployment was only 10.5%. Most families were able to still afford gas by cutting back on discretionary spending. When oil rises to $147 per barrel the next time around, we might have twice as many Americans who are unemployed. Families won't have any discretionary spending left to cut back on. The average American family might have to eat less and stop air conditioning and heating their home just to afford gas for their car. While U.S. consumer spending has risen 5 months in a row, mainly due to rising prices, the U.S. savings rate has fallen to 3.1%, its lowest since October of 2008. 43% of Americans now have less than $10,000 saved for retirement. What's going to happen when the U.S. government is inevitably forced to default on its Social Security obligations? Retirement will become a thing of the past. Americans getting ready to retire need to assume now that Social Security won't be there.
Bernie Madoff is in jail for a reason. He's in jail because Ponzi schemes don't work. They don't work when the private sector tries them, and they don't work when the government tries them. We have a coming disaster in Social Security if we don't do something, and do something about it soon.
The U.S. national debt is now $12.8 trillion, However, the U.S. government is refusing to include the debts of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac on its balance sheet, when these are now government-controlled entities. Including the Fannie-Freddie debt of $6.3 trillion, our real national debt is $19.1 trillion. Once you include our $60 trillion in unfunded liabilities for Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, our total federal obligations have now reached $79 trillion, or more than 5.5 times our GDP of $14.2 trillion. It will be impossible for our debts to ever be repaid without the U.S. printing the money and creating hyperinflation. America's greatest business success story of the past decade has been Apple Inc., maker of the iPod, iPhone, and the new iPad. For fiscal year 2009, Apple recorded a $2.28 billion expense for federal income taxes. The U.S. would need to see the creation of 700 companies like Apple in the next year just to generate enough tax revenue to balance our projected 2010 budget deficit. This is impossible. The only way our economy can truly recover is for the government to dramatically slash spending across the board and eliminate unnecessary departments like the Department of Energy.
The reason they started it was they were going to end our dependence on foreign oil. That was the goal. That's why we have it. Well, you know, when we started it, we imported about 50% of our oil. Now we import 70% of our oil. It's been a colossal failure. They spend $30 billion a year. Abolish it.
Unfortunately, what's going on in Washington today is a charade. If the Republicans were in power, they would have supported the recently passed health care bill. There is absolutely no difference between Republicans and Democrats. Neither of them are for limited government and protecting the Constitution. The very existence of the Federal Reserve and the printing of fiat currency is unconstitutional, yet there is still no widespread outrage about it. Americans are distracted by the daily debates in Washington and about whether to raise or lower taxes. But considering that federal tax receipts have remained relatively constant as a percentage of GDP over periods of many decades, proves that taxes are a moot issue. Americans are already taxed to the hilt. Any additional taxes will bring in less tax revenues. There is no chance of our country ever paying off its national debt and unfunded liabilities through taxation. Americans will ultimately feel the pain for all of the government's wasteful spending through inflation. Inflation is currently the last thought on the average American's mind, but soon it will be their primary concern.
Inflation merely postpones problems. It diverts resources into sectors where they wouldn't otherwise go and where an undisturbed economy would not have allocated them. Eventually, resources, including labor, need to go where the market wants them to go. There's no avoiding that.
The U.S. is currently in a brief period of euphoria where the Federal Reserve's monetary inflation has created the appearance of an economic recovery without the devastating side effects of massive price inflation. Although it is possible for the stimulus-induced melt-up to last for another year or two without hyperinflation, it will without a doubt end in an economic holocaust that completely wipes out the savings and income of the middle class.
The stimulus provided by inflation is due to the errors which it produces. That's where your stimulus comes from. Inflation is making possible the propping up of things that shouldn't be propped up and the starting of things that shouldn't be started. So these things have to be liquidated anyway, and the correction will be all the worse.
The Federal Reserve created the real estate bubble when it tried to keep the dot-com bubble artificially inflated by lowering interest rates in 2003 down to 1%. The recession that we needed to have in 2003 so that the free market could rebalance the economy simply never occurred. In a last-ditch effort to correct our economic imbalances caused by the Federal Reserve, the free market made a desperate attempt to enter the U.S. into a depression in late 2008. The Federal Reserve lowered interest rates to 0%, and the depression never occurred. They simply kicked the can down the road. Historically, one of the best performing periods for precious metals has been when the Federal Reserve begins to raise artificially low interest rates. While investors initially expect rising interest rates to be bad for precious metals, they forget that even as the Fed begins to raise artificially low rates, interest rates will remain very inflationary until they reach a level that is higher than the real rate of inflation. During the 1970s, Gold's bull run from $35 per ounce to a high of $850 per ounce for a gain of 2,329% came during a time of rising interest rates.